So apparently, people are expecting me to talk about a bunch of things. Compliance at velocity, and things like that. Yeah, we'll probably talk about that, but actually, fairly recently, it was the anniversary for the publication of Alice in Wonderland. Did you guys know that? Yeah, it was, 150 years. Who's read Alice in Wonderland? Right. How many years ago did you read it? 20 years ago? Yeah? Some of you weren't born then. Bless you. Right? Some of us were old then. So Alice in Wonderland, some of you might have seen my other presentation on Moby Dick as a way of thinking about how you transform large organizations. Well, I'm going to use Alice in Wonderland as a way of talking about compliance and ruggedness and security and some things like that. I guess we'll have to see how it goes, okay? So Alice in Wonderland at its core is a story about a person, this girl, who enters this world where rules are contingent, right? They suddenly appear and they're arbitrary. Can you all remember that? Yeah? It's crazy time. So, does that sound familiar? I mean, for those of you that are on the sharp end of some security, and I love you, Shannon, thing, right? It can sometimes feel super arbitrary. And so one of the things that I'd like us to think about in the next sort of 20 minutes, I can't see a clock, which is good. But one of the things I'd like us to think about in the next 20 minutes is, what is this unifying idea? What is this unifying idea that holds ideas about compliance and ruggedness and security together? Because I'm not sure there has been one, and I think that that's a problem. So let's talk about that a little bit. So the illustrations that you see are courtesy of Salvador Dali, not me. So these illustrations, you know you've made it, right, when Dali illustrates your book. Yeah? Where's Jez? That's the next step for you, Jez, wherever he is. So in The Matrix, Neo had to follow the white rabbit. And so, of course, in Alice in Wonderland, Alice had to follow the white rabbit. And she follows this white rabbit down the hole. Now, throughout the entire book, essentially, it's the rabbit that is kind of the guide for her through the book. The rabbit is kind of making the rules that matter. The rabbit is the guidepost for her to get out the other side, if you like, of Wonderland. Now, what is this unifying idea that we have in our organizations? What are the rules that really matter? How many compliance efforts have we been part of? How many security efforts have we been part of? When it appears that in actual fact what we're just doing is adding additional lists, adding to lists of other requirements. It's this never-ending process of just adding more detail. Do you agree, or is it just me? Yeah? So what's going on? What are the rules? How do we get to the point where we understand those rules that matter? So I have this crazy idea, and it comes from Josh and the other guys and from Rugged. I think rules that matter are rules that, when tested, make you stronger, make you better. That's what ruggedness is, right? Or the Nassim Taleb stuff, the anti-fragility, right? When you're tested, you get better. It's not just when you're tested, you pass an audit, you get a badge, and you move on. When you're tested, you get better. Now, ironically, this is actually exactly the same thing that happens in Alice in Wonderland. So, 3 things happen, starting from the left. So Alice goes down the hole, she starts to cry, and she's, of course, a giant, and her tears create this massive flood. And she meets animals, and she says, "Where's my cat?" Which, of course, freaks the animals out. And then there's this incredibly bizarre, super surreal, don't read it when you're high kind of situation where an animal's giving a lecture and they all nearly drown, and then they decide to run around in circles until they get dry. Sounds like a lot of CAD meetings, but anyway, we'll get to that. And then, of course, finally, what we also have is then this other situation where the white rabbit quickly appears. And as the white rabbit appears, she has to go look for something, and she suddenly starts to find that her size is uncontrollable, and she suddenly starts to grow again after having shrunk. So this entire part of the novel is chaos. Absolute chaos. So there's like 5 chapters where she has no idea who she is. But it also establishes for us some core basic ideas about how we as a community, as a DevOps community, think that we should, or the key questions we have to ask in those times of chaos. 1, scale. What is the effective scale at which we can implement change? Isn't every single one of us asking that question? You have a set of requirements that you want to be implementing, whether they be compliance things or security things, whatever the case may be. How do you implement them? At what effective level? It's so easy, isn't it, to affect it in one team? Isn't it easy to make one team agree with you, like your team? How do you get the whole organization to agree? How do you get the whole organization to change? So the big question that Alice is beginning to get a grip on is she's trying to understand how can she make her way through Wonderland and at the same time try and comprehend what this entire whole of it is. She just wants to get her little path through. In actual fact, she wants to find her cat, but she needs to kind of understand Wonderland in order to do that. And so similarly, if you're trying to drive change, what you're trying to do is you're just trying to understand what's the effective level that I can start implementing that change at. However, we know from DevOps that what you want to do is you want to have small circles, small iterations, right? And so in this particular case, the animals run around in circles and they get nowhere. How many times do we find that we have agile teams that implement agile, and we have iteration, and we have the implementation of all those good things, but we don't get more rugged? We don't get more secure. Why is it that we have projects that are shipping software, and yet for some reason the software that's being shipped is not becoming inherently more secure? We're not becoming better. We're not better understanding the wonderland that we're traveling through, which is this insecure place that we live in. We're just shipping software. Do you find that your software development process inherently makes you more secure? Yes or no? No? There's got to be something wrong with that, right? And so we know that iteration is important. We know that small iterations are important. But what would we iterate on from a compliance point of view? From a security point of view, what are we iterating on? Can you see that these two languages are almost completely different? There's the language of Wonderland and there's this language of everything else. It's almost as if we're in two different worlds. Now, an interesting thing happens when we start thinking about the size that Alice grows to in this house, the final piece. And really what that's got to do with is us beginning to understand what role do we have to play in our attempt to start driving this change within our organizations. We have to ourselves be clear about the role that we want to play as change agents per se. Now, we've already said that what we want is we want to be in an organization where we're beginning to find the rules that matter. We see that in times of chaos, there is a need for us to understand the effective scale that we operate at. We also see that it's important for us to be iterating, but we don't have a sense of what that unifying idea is that we understand what we're iterating through. And so Alice has some interesting things. So Alice goes and she sees a caterpillar. How's this for trippy? She sees a caterpillar sitting on a mushroom smoking a hookah. Okay? In San Francisco, people are going, yeah, whatever. It's just around the corner. But this is what she sees, right? So the caterpillar says to her, so here's the thing. If you eat from the left-hand side of the mushroom, you grow bigger. And if you eat from the right-hand side of the mushroom, you grow smaller. And so what does she do? Remember, this whole thing of iteration, this idea of iteration has already been introduced. So what does she do? She takes a couple and she just arbitrarily starts chomping on the mushroom. So her legs go big and her arms go, and she, and there's no control. Again, there's chaos. And so what we have is her own beginning to understand. She begins to understand that she needs to take small bites, understand the implication of these small bites, understand how these rules operate in small changes in the world that she's in. And so she does that, and through a succession of small iterations, she gets to be the right size. And then she meets a different kind of cat, the Cheshire Cat, right? Everyone remember with the Cheshire Cat? So the Cheshire Cat is that cat that disappears until the only thing left is its smile. But Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, like, which way should I go? And the Cheshire Cat says, well, it depends. Where do you want to go? And she says, well, I'm not entirely sure. And the Cheshire Cat says, well, it doesn't really matter which path you take, then does it? So this begins to be the question. How do we begin to start giving our organizations a path to go that allows them to start creating this unification between the rules that it needs to follow and what it needs to make in order to be successful? Because we're doing these iterations, we're biting on the mushroom, we're beginning to understand what it means in order to be effective in this world, in order to be compliant, but we still have an outcome that we're trying to achieve. Security in and of itself, compliance in and of itself, is this an outcome? No. It's a property of this outcome that we want. How do we unify the two? And so we come to this law, the Cheshire Cat's law. If your capability to comply exceeds your capability to create, you will always create the past. So let me just translate that for you. If you're better at making rules than you are at making product, you'll tend to make rules and not product. Is that what you guys want to be part of? Because here's I think, the core conceptual idea here. At the moment, the way that you're choosing when the Cheshire Cat asks you is, I don't care, man, as long as it's secure or rugged. What does that mean? What does it mean? What gives us the outcome, what we get from Agile and from DevOps and from these other communities is this incredible, inexorable force of the customer asking us for product, asking us for features, pulling us through, saying we want this, we want this, we want this, otherwise we're going to shift. It's just like the rabbit. We're chasing the rabbit. The customer tells us which rules matter. And unless we are in a world of small iterations, listening to the customer telling us which rules matter, and iterating on those rules and on that product, we will tend to not have any idea where we go. And if we don't know where we're going, we don't know which side of the mushroom to bite, do we? Because so far, at this particular part of the book, when she meets the Cheshire Cat, she's been big, she's been small, she's been big, she's been small, and she's been multiple sizes. So the question in Alice in Wonderland is always, how big, what size, what is the effective size that I need to be? We ask in the same question. We have no idea what we need to be unless we're located in that customer conversation and that customer dialogue. And so, Arbuckle's law, if your capability to comply exceeds your capability to create, you will always tend to create products of the past, not products of the future. So how do we get beyond that into this point where we're starting to unify this with an idea of security and compliance and ruggedness? Well, the basic idea here is, and I suppose the corollary is, we need to be as good at creating product as we are at compliance, or as good at creating product as we are at making that product secure. These things need to be an identity. They need to be the same. They need to be delivered together. What is the one thing that stops them from being delivered together? There are different conversations today. There are even different conferences, for goodness sake. And you wonder why we have the separation. So, the second law. There are always riddles and never jam. So Alice goes to the Mad Hatter's tea party. Mad Hatter's the dude with the big hat. And the Mad Hatter's tea party, they are telling each other riddles. And there's some famous riddles, like, why is a raven like a writing desk? And one of the people at the tea party, the dormouse, I think, asks for some jam on his scones. And the Mad Hatter says, nope, jam tomorrow. And of course, the joke is it's always jam tomorrow. So you can see that Lewis Carroll used to be a mathematician because it's the identity, the maths, it's always jam tomorrow. So when you get to tomorrow, well, it's still jam tomorrow. So the question is, it's always riddles in this particular world. But once you've understood how to work out the riddles, you're able to navigate your way through. Now, similarly, what we're able to do is we're able to translate our security and compliance rules into code. This is what we are able to do. We are able to encode the policies and the security policies that we have for the individual infrastructure that we build. We're able to encode the security policies that we have for the processes that we implement. We're able to encode those to make them code. Now, if they happen to be made of code, the same code that we use to make the product, we now don't have the separation between the things. We now have a convergence. It's all code. So its infrastructure is code, its security or policy is code, and its application is code. Because the reality is that if you do have an organization, and any of you are working in an environment where you are expecting or relying on an organization to in some way be observing and making sure that a policy is being effectively implemented, as opposed to it being automated, you know that you will always be lagging behind, insecure, inconsistent in the implementation of that policy. That's not only just because of humans being what humans are, but the problem with the personal or the manual implementation of these rules is that they tend to be changed as different people think they're in different worlds that they're in. So, in large organizations that I've managed before, you will have people who implement the same rules, interpret the same rules, the same manual implementation completely differently in France, let's say, from Germany. This, of course, is what we find all the time. And so this need to converge the requirements, both the security and the infrastructure requirements into this basic common language of code, is absolutely critical for us to kind of create this unification, because what it does is it allows us to think of this force of the customer pulling us through, saying we want new product, we want these new features, as being exactly the same force that pulls through the need for the security that is required by those features. And historically, that's what's been missing. Have you noticed that what you've been is you probably react very viscerally to the story of chaos at the beginning of Alice in Wonderland? How do I make that change? These guys keep on going in circles. There's theater. Remember that story, that part where they were running around and round in circles? And we spoke about iteration. But doesn't that also give you the impression of theater? How much theater of compliance is there in your organization? Right? I mean, it's literally theater. We also have another idea of control. There's this myth of control. If you are a highly skilled security engineer, or if you're a highly skilled developer, the ability of your manager to be able to effectively understand and quality control what you're doing is extremely limited. There is no control. There is no compliance there. There is no quality control there. Is there? And so again, this is another one of the ideas that Alice begins to call into question. How is it that she is able to control her own identity within this land? And similarly, no one else is really able to control it either. So the funny thing about Alice in Wonderland is she's not a victim. She's just this arbitrary person passing through Wonderland, which I think is one of the most incredible things about this particular story. Thanks. So the core idea around ensuring that we translate these organizational rules, whether they be security or compliance, into code, is not only to enable the consistency, it's also to begin to reduce the arbitrariness, to begin to reduce the theater. Because what we now have is we now have the ability to be able to define exactly what are we iterating around. We also understand exactly how to define the effective area of influence that we need. So for instance, you have a choice. We could decide to standardize on a standardized approach to configuring firewalls across your entire business, which is kind of a horizontal play. Or you could make a decision to try and implement a standard set of security approaches, let's say the Center for Internet Security, across or within an entire application vertical. Either way, what you have is you have a very well-defined set of requirements, where those set of requirements are testable within that vertical because they are related to code. And this is often what we refer to as compliance at velocity. So finally, it's so common. I think this is probably said at every single one of these that I've been to, and that is involving security and compliance people early on is absolutely critical. If we look at the novel once again, you'll find that the entire story was essentially all a shadow, an overflow from the Queen of Hearts party, which is what we identify right at the end of towards the end of the book. And they're playing croquet with flamingos. For those of you that have seen the movie, right? They're playing croquet with flamingos. They're trying to work out who stole the tarts. The entire story is just an overflow from this crazy party. And it begs the question, what would happen if Alice had been there at the beginning of the party? There would have been none of this need to experiment with all of the rules and the chaos that you went through. But the core idea here is, in this particular case, in the case of Alice in Wonderland, the language and the world was absurd by intention, by definition. The worlds that we're trying to create are not supposed to be absurd, I hope. And so what we have to do is we have to ensure that everyone who is going to be party to this converged language, where infrastructure, compliance, applications, security people are all present at the same time, they all need to be together from early on. And so if you happen to be a developer, stop asking the security guys to join you, please, three months into the project and wonder why they're not happy with what you've done. So the final thing is whether this is my last slide before the shepherd hook comes out. So were there ever any tarts? So the whole story is about who stole the tarts. And it creates so much recrimination towards the end. And Alice at one point is accused of stealing the tarts. You know what? My view, there were never any tarts. There were never any tarts. And the core idea that I would like to leave you with is this idea of a distinct or an independent thing called compliance that is separate from the core requirements that we build into a product is not sustainable. The reason why it's not sustainable is we will always start individually to create silos out of it. We will become really, really good at building rules and making rules, and we'll become less good at product. And as we become less good at product, the companies that are needing to be good at product, but who are great at compliance, will slowly fall behind. Your ability to be great security professionals, great rugged professionals, is entirely based upon your ability to be great product professionals. Thank you.